In on a growing industry, a robust industry, the podcast industry, and of course music streaming as well, focusing in here on Spotify and some of its competitors. Joining us live is TD Ameritrade Network contributor Jenny Horn and the VP of Research at LikeFolio.com, Megan Brantley. All right, guys, Jenny, we're talking Spotify here, but you can't really talk Spotify nowadays without talking Apple as well. So I'm interested to see what you guys have on this particular topic. It's also one that I don't know if a one-year chart really tells the whole story. You may have to zoom out because it's found some volatility as of late, but it's had an incredible run over the last year and some change.
Yes, and you stole my point, actually, Alex. That's exactly what I was going to start with. That if you look at this name on a yearly chart, it doesn't look so hot. It's about 40% off of its all-time highs of about $3.87 a share right now. But if you zoom out at the big picture, relative to its run up over in 2020 into 21, I mean, it does look still pretty strong. Granted, has sold off a degree since February, but relatively still looking very strong. Now, Spotify is the world's most popular streaming service right now, with a community of more than 356 million monthly active users, which 158 million are their premium subscribers. They have a presence in over 178 markets with more than 70 million tracks. And like you just mentioned, podcasts are now so huge. They have over 2.6 million podcast titles. Now, what I didn't know is podcasts are actually the fastest growing media segment today. Spotify has really begun to capitalize on this, and they're shelling out billions for some of the top talent in the podcast. So they just bought the Joe Rogan Experience for $100 million. They also recently purchased a Barstool Sports podcast for $60 million total. So really, both of these titles have millions of weekly listeners. They're hugely popular, which is, of course, great for Spotify. Now, the average Spotify or podcast listener is 35 years old, which I think is really important. When you compare that to radio, which the average user is 47 years old, and network television, which is 57 years old. So because this is a younger demographic, they're really able to capitalize on growth in this market that is very actually new, relative speaking. Now, PwC estimates that podcasts will jump their ad revenue from about $860 million in 2021 to almost $2 billion by 2024. So ad revenue is another part of this space that Spotify stands to capitalize on. Now, from a financial perspective, this company is growing at a very healthy rate. In their last quarter, first quarter, they reported that their monthly active users increased 24% year over year, with premium subscribers up 21%. So those are two metrics that are very important to this name. Now, they also announced a 26% growth margin last quarter, which was a massive improvement from the 16% gross margin they saw back in 2017. So from a financial perspective, this company is growing at a very healthy pace. Plus, you add this podcast element in, it stands for growth. Now, the one risk analysts are saying is that they may be shelling out a bit too much cash, actually, for some of these names that, it could actually end up hurting them. Their cash burn right now is pretty significant. It kind of reminds me, actually, of Netflix a few years back when they were still a younger company. But, being the largest player in this space, I actually think that having this top talent in the podcast area actually gives them a degree of pricing power as we move forward, because, they sort of will own the rights to all of these different podcasts that everyone sort of listens to. And no surprise, the noise on Twitter today, super, super positive on Spotify, more positive than I thought, and more tweets than I thought. So that brings me to our first tweet of the day, which says, Spotify, this would easily be a $750 stock one day. Tried to push as hard as I could for people to check this one out. Absolutely beautiful monthly close. So 750 is bold, I will say. It is almost 3 times where the stock is currently trading. But, I love to see the optimism. And it's hard to not mention Apple, like you mentioned, Alex, when we look at this name, because I do say there are a lot of players in this space, and competition is undoubtedly heating up. But our next tweeter doesn't seem to think it really matters for Spotify. So he says, a lot of amazing songs I discover on Spotify have 500,000 streams, but less than 10,000 views on YouTube. Spotify's magic is taking commoditized content and showing it to the right people at the right time. They completely own the demand side. So I thought this was a really good point, that right now they're saying that their ability to commoditize content is why they're such a leader in this space. And so, Megan, I must know, compared to Pandora, Apple Music, some of these other big players, are they completely owning the demand side like our tweeter just talked about?
Yeah, so this is kind of why we wanted to talk about Spotify today, is because we try to take a look at whenever we start to see a name emerge as a leader in its industry. And this is kind of what we're seeing when we look at this near-term demand growth for Spotify. Whenever you consider the year that they had last year, it's really tough to make those year-over-year comparisons just because there were a lot of people that were at home. There were a lot of people that joined the streaming service, kind of switched things up. But when you look at demand in the quarter that just ended, so this was June 30th, they just wrapped up their second quarter. We have that 40% higher than the levels that we recorded in 2019. So I think that this is, a really strong growth trajectory for Spotify, as Jenny, you've already hit on. This green line right here, those are purchase intent mentions. Those are people who are signing up and using Spotify. And you can see that now they're on the upswing again. We've got those pacing up about 6% quarter over quarter, a nice new, at least, growth trend. And so this is just a name that I think one thing that has allowed it to continue to grow is this innovation, this move into podcasting. I think that a lot of people question this at first, but for all of the reasons that you previously mentioned, the potential in ad revenue, the fact that they're building up kind of a unique, almost original content like niche, I think is really powerful for the company. And you can see they're outperforming their competition, especially in this space. These are mentions of people who are using, a lot of different platforms to listen to a podcast, and then also thrown in there just the generic trend of listening to a podcast. And what you can see is not only is Spotify outperforming Apple Podcast growth, while both are growing, Spotify is, double digits stronger versus Apple, but they are also bucking the generic just listening to a podcast trend as that starts to normalize a bit on a year-over-year basis. So these are two, I think, really key elements to watch. Can Spotify continue growing its user base? And then also, can they continue to, release these new products to keep existing users happy and keep existing users on board so that whenever they do, for example, these price increases like we've seen come into play in this last quarter, they don't have significant rates of churn, that they can, keep these users sticking around and loyal to their platform.
Guys, how many companies do we know can state that in terms of Spotify versus iTunes, we went up against Apple and we crushed them? Because I think Spotify has crushed iTunes. They have made iTunes in my world from a key part of my world to non-existent in my world. And the user base, and what when I look at their earnings, I look at a company that looks like they're on the verge of becoming profitable. That quarterly loss looks like it's about to turn positive. And just like Netflix, they have that pricing power, like Megan said, where they can ease up prices and no one will change. And they'll retain the large portion. So the unlikely battle between Spotify and Apple, this is, David and Goliath is a story. It's not a story because Goliath won. It's a story because David won. And I think that's what you're seeing here with Apple and Spotify. And they have carved out this area of both music and now podcasts, and they are spectacular at it. But Megan, my question to you is, do you ever look or do you ever have comparisons or data on Spotify music versus iTunes and growth in those two metrics?
Yeah, so whenever we look, at least from a near-term basis, we see Spotify, those demand mentions in terms of, signing up for using the platform are pacing up about 6% quarter over quarter. For iTunes, this is really interesting. We kind of lump in this Apple Music with iTunes just because a lot of people use the two hand in hand. And those have fallen about 10% quarter over quarter. Whenever you compare, SiriusXM versus Pandora, those have fallen even more. So while this is just showing, the podcast comparison, if you were to look at, say, a scatter plot, you'd see Spotify as the only name in the right quadrant of that scatter plot. And you'd see Apple Music then in second place, down about 10% quarter over quarter, with SiriusXM and Pandora to the farthest to the left, which is not necessarily where you want to be. So I think that this kind of, the way that this is emerging and this near-term strength is why we've kind of got an eye on Spotify to say, okay, what are they doing right? I think one thing that they're doing right is podcasting. And another thing, that tweet that Jenny presented was really strong. The fact that there's this personalization aspect, this discovery aspect that's, what we tend to see in tweets when we're looking at this in terms of what people love. People are talking about these, this only for you feature, their Discover Weeklies. They're talking about, one of the highest mentions that we track for Spotify yearly is whenever they do that year-end wrap, and you get to see what you listened to over the most year. Mm-hmm. And that was just personalized.
That's amazing.
To you. Right. And so I think that that's really how Spotify is elevating themselves, at least for now. And, we're definitely starting to pick up on some momentum.
Yeah, Megan, the yearly recap is like the best free advertising for Spotify, because you see people share theirs all over social media, and it's like all you see for a week straight. So that's a really great thing for them. But I actually had a question about the last graphic that you just talked about. So listening to a podcast is down 15.6%, but then Spotify podcasts are up 28%. So is this a concern? Because although Spotify is clearly the leader, they're outperforming Apple in this space, listening to podcasts is down. Now, I know you mentioned that year-over-year comps are difficult with the pandemic and everything that happened last year, but is this still a concern? Because although Spotify is leading, listening to podcasts are down, correct?
Yes. And so that's definitely something we want to watch. That's definitely something we want to key into to say, okay, is this something that, people are getting necessarily sick of podcasts? I don't think that that's the case, just because of the massive spike that we recorded around this year that makes it a little bit tough. But one thing I think is interesting is that Spotify noted is that, while their, I think, monthly active users of podcasts was relatively stable, that growth rate was pretty stable in the last quarter, the rate at which their users listen to podcasts increased by about 20% quarter over quarter. So I think that they're, normalizing this behavior for this key consumer base, which is really smart. But that's definitely something we'll want to pay attention to make sure that this continues to provide tailwinds for the company, especially since they're investing so much in this area.
Megan, are you guys getting any data or any information on anything in the pipeline for Spotify, right? I mean, podcasts started to creep up, and then Spotify made a huge splash with podcasts. Is there anything coming up on the horizon for Spotify that you guys have identified, or the data has identified? Anything you can share with us in terms of what's coming up for a stock like Spotify?
There were some rumors when we look at just overall mention buzz. There were rumors that Spotify could get into the live music space, whether that's, virtual concerts or even actual concerts. I don't think that they're trying to become this live event, mega platform, but there was speculation as to how they could, leverage this massive, consumer data that they essentially have, these preferences of people who are listening to music, and transition that into potentially these concert events. So I think that that's rumors and speculation right now. So that hasn't really materialized in terms of consumer demand yet, but that is something that definitely, that kind of buzz uptick whenever that was speculated upon earlier this week, moved the needle a little bit.
Megan, I'm looking at your overall full company purchase intent mentions chart as we kind of tie this all together. The correlation between these two lines that we have on this chart, one being your consumer purchase intent mentions that you're analyzing in the stock price performance of Spotify. I mean, these two are basically hand in hand. I know we have my platform up on the screen, but maybe we can get that pulled up. But it seems as though your data is actually a leading indicator in this case. And so when you're looking at that historically, does that give you even more kind of optimism on this name when you're starting to see that turn up, and then you sort of see the stock start to follow, that you might be onto something a little bit early?
Yeah, I think that, those are the key things that we're looking for. Is you like to see that green line, as you mentioned, leading the stock line, because that's whenever there becomes a significant opportunity for traders or for investors. And so this is one where we're starting to see that momentum. Like I talked about, you're starting to see that green line, tick up. And so we definitely want to see this continue. But so far, overall, like that demand level is pacing about 40% higher than it was in 2019, which I think is really critical for Spotify to continue growing. I think it's also relevant to note that we're only listening to these English-speaking tweets, and one really relevant area of Spotify's growth are these international users. So there could be a wild card factor in there that could be either good or bad for Spotify, but it's relevant to just note that factor at play. However, at least from our English speaking tweets, we're starting to see some momentum, and we like that a little bit of divergence forming from a long-term growth perspective. We think that, Spotify, this could potentially be a huge long-term winner.
Jenny Horn, Megan Brantley, great conversation as always. Have a great weekend, both of you guys. We'll catch up next week. Kevin, you're sticking around, though. I'm sticking around. We're going to talk trading Spotify now. Kev, a couple things just to make this a little bit more fun for you. I'm going to push back on a couple of these things. I've been